All right, it is recording. Well, welcome everyone to another monthly meeting. I'm Ashley, and I'm joined by our lovely Miss Asha. And we're super excited to be back to get to talk with you guys, to bring you guys another person who is on the front lines with fighting human trafficking alongside the Red Cord and all the other organizations that we featured on these interviews. So today we're super excited to be talking with Mr. Terry FitzPatrick, who is the Senior Communications and Media Relations Specialist for Free the Slaves. So we're going to have a lot of questions for Mr. Terry. We've already had some of them beforehand, but we're going to be focusing on this month's theme, which is back to school. As most of you know, we like to focus on what students, what teachers, what parents can start focusing on as the kids go back to school. What are some things that young people can get involved with as they begin their activism when it comes to fighting human trafficking, because that's something that you guys know that we've really been wanting to focus on recently. How can young people get involved, and what are some ways that we can start getting this next generation to be the best, if you will, activists that are out there when it comes to fighting human trafficking. So Terry, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to the interview. So if you wouldn't mind to start with a little bit of an introduction of who you are and just a little background of how you got started in the anti-human trafficking movement.
Oh, sure. Thanks. And I'm glad to be here. You know, I started as a journalist and worked in the Texas Panhandle, actually, early in my career. And I've seen a lot of things that are rough to see. And journalists are taught, and we learn very early on, that you will meet people on the worst day of their life. A tornado has come through, or a pandemic has hit, or a plane has crashed, or something's gone wrong, and we show up and have to talk to people about it. And if you can't work in situations of trauma or uncertainty or physical insecurity, you might not be safe, you won't get very far in journalism. Now, fast forward 20 years, and a friend of mine who actually also worked in Amarillo, in Texas, had founded Free the Slaves, the organization I work for now. And she asked me to come make some videos about people in modern forms of slavery and the heroes who are helping to liberate them. And I started making these films and realized every day was the worst day. It was relentless. It wasn't just a one-off misfortune that had befallen someone, but it also was deeply psychologically traumatizing, because traffickers use intimidation and violence to keep people in place. And so that switched me, that converted me from journalist to activists. And that's what I've been doing ever since. That was about 12 years ago, and I haven't looked back. So I use my skills as a filmmaker and as a journalist to help tell the story of modern slavery, that it still exists, and what's being done to fight it.
That's awesome. Wow. What a neat transition of life that you probably weren't expecting going into journalism originally.
Well, that's another thing you learn as a journalist, is you never know what's next.
Yeah.
Something different every day.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about Free the Slaves, other than doing the documentaries.
Sure. So Free the Slaves was founded in the year 2000, so 21 years old now. It's one of the founding organizations of the modern anti-slavery, anti-trafficking movement. And it came about just as the world was really waking up to the fact that this was happening. And so Free the Slaves founded with 4 pillars, 4 ideas for action. One is wake the world up to the fact that this is happening, and that slavery has taken on new forms, and there are more people in those forms of enslavement today around the world than were ever enslaved during the transatlantic slave trade. So it's a huge problem. The second pillar was to get governments to do something about it. This was not just a charity project. This was something that needs governmental action and law enforcement and funding at a scale that only governments could provide. The third pillar for action was to continue to do academic, university quality research, so that it couldn't just be said we're trying to raise money for ourselves, but that there's actually academic, peer-reviewed journal articles about where it's happening, why it's happening, who it's happening to, and what can be done about it effectively and cost effectively. And the fourth pillar for Free the Slaves was to experiment with community pilot projects in overseas where the problem is worst, and help educate people about their rights and empower them to exercise their rights. Because most people don't know that this is illegal. They just assume that crummy jobs are the way the world is. And our job is to help bring people together, mobilize them to exercise their human rights, women's rights, child rights, labor rights, migrant rights, and human rights, and to make that happen at a community level, prevention, and help people realize that together they can fight this, whereas individually they're easy targets for traffickers. So that's Free the Slaves today. We operate now in the Middle East and in North Africa and through Central and West Africa, through Southeast Asia, in the Caribbean, and in Latin America.
Wow. So percentage wise, how much of what you guys do is focused on national trafficking, and how much is based on the international aspect of it?
Well, so our field programs at the moment are focused entirely internationally. However, we actually convene the anti-trafficking movement annually, globally, in something called the Freedom from Slavery Forum, which includes many of the organizations inside the US. And I also serve as the co-chair of a group called the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking, ATTEST is our acronym. And that's a coalition of 15 of the largest US-based anti-trafficking organizations that work both overseas and inside the US, and work with law enforcement, work on shelters for survivors, work on education programs, work on along the southern border in particular, and work in industries where there's a lot of forced labor today. And so we advocate for stronger federal laws and for increased federal funding for programs, from the FBI to Homeland Security to the Justice Department, to Health and Human Services, to education, to labor, all the different federal departments, and with the White House too. So our advocacy work touches a lot on what goes on in the United States, because the US is the global leader in the fight today. The US spends something like $250 to $400 million a year on anti-trafficking programs, both and prevention programs, both in the US and around the world. And that's more than anyone else. It's actually more than everyone else combined. And so the US is a global leader. So our organization helps do advocacy work to ensure that we continue that work.
That's amazing. I love that aspect that you guys do both the international and the national, because oftentimes, since it is, like you said, such a big problem, organizations find themselves only being able to focus on one. You know what I mean? It's like they can only focus on one aspect of it because it is so broad. But it sounds like you guys definitely have your hands in as much as possible, which is amazing. Definitely inspiring. That's for sure.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's the idea is that there's 40 million people in modern forms of slavery around the world today. And you cannot just kick down 40 million doors and rescue people one at a time. That would be an endless task. That couldn't be accomplished. So you need to have systemic change. And that kind of systemic changes mean you need to work with governments, and you need to think about why people are vulnerable to enslavement and how you can change those conditions. That's actually the mission statement for Free the Slaves, which is liberate people from slavery and change the conditions that allow modern slavery to exist. And our unique, maybe I could say, contribution, most important to the movement, has been that we don't just think about the individual as a victim. Now, of course, we help get people and extricate them from forced labor and sex slavery and sex trafficking and forced marriage slavery. But we think of the community and where their home is as victimized by slavery. And because the forces that make one person vulnerable tend to make other people in their family vulnerable and other people in that neighborhood or entire village vulnerable. So the solutions are to uplift everyone and not just rescue one individual. And so that's the policy side of it, and not just the field activism side of it.
Yeah, that makes total sense to us. That's kind of how we view things too, just within our own little community here in Lawton, of networking with other nonprofits that are helping to reduce the vulnerabilities within our community, right? You know, they're providing housing, they're providing food security, they're providing job skills or education skills. And you know, people will say, well, they're not fighting human trafficking. How can you say that? But they are, you know, they are. By reducing our vulnerabilities within a community, they're reducing the chances of someone being trafficked, you know, being preyed on those vulnerabilities.
It's true, because these rights and vulnerabilities, they call it intersectionality in sociological lingo. But I mean, they all interconnect.
Right.
And so people become vulnerable for all sorts of reasons, and traffickers look for this. And it goes as well to runaway and homeless youth, and to domestic violence, and to situations that leave children, for example, or young people estranged from their support network and social fabric that helps protect them from people who would exploit them. So this continuity of community services and rights enforcement is the way to go overall to help reduce the risk and the prevalence of human trafficking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the more vulnerabilities we can reduce, the less chance we continue the cycle of trafficking. You know, like that's the one way to stop it is to stop it from starting.
And true, and you know, they say it can happen to anyone, and that is true. Yeah. But it tends to happen to people who are particularly vulnerable. So people who face systemic discrimination based on all sorts of characteristics are systemically vulnerable. And so you need to think about those kind of problems as well. And this goes internationally as well as inside the US. So people who, for example, are migrating to look for work, that is just a field day for traffickers who pose as legitimate labor recruiters. And once they get you away from your family, your money, your documents, your cell phone, your legal system, sometimes even your language, then the penny drops. And all of a sudden you realize, I'm way far from home and I'm on my own now. And the traffickers have all the power. The other thing, just globally, that is really problematic is debt. And when you don't have decent healthcare systems, or they're affordable, and when you don't have decent policing systems, when you don't have places where people can borrow money legitimately at decent interest rates, then when disaster strikes, and it always does strike, there's a drought, there's a flood, there's something happens that affects many, many people, or it could be just a family, a road accident or a medical emergency. People end up having to borrow money from anyone who will lend it to them informally. And then they fall into what's called debt bondage, and they have to work it off under conditions of enslavement. Those are the two biggest forms of modern slavery. And there's a bit of a misunderstanding about whether we're connected to this problem or not. We are, because it's most of people that are in modern forms of slavery today work on farms, or on cattle ranches, or in meatpacking industries, or in hotels, or even in private homes as domestics, or as landscaping crews, or janitorial crews. They work in agriculture and vegetable picking. They work in mines and in fishing, and in factories, especially smaller factories that do garment sewing, and in the fashion industry. So 25 million of the 40 million 21 million of the 40 million who are in modern forms of enslavement are in forced labor situations, even in prisons. We think of what's going on in China, for example, with the Uyghur population that is being imprisoned with religious discrimination, and the forced labor that goes on inside those detention camps. We even have forced labor going on inside American detention camps and prison. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding about what modern slavery or human trafficking is. It's mostly things we're connected to through food, through clothing, through electronics, and through jewelry, through just everyday products and services that we buy. So I always say, Don't be complacent about that. Don't be complicit if you can. Try to avoid some of those tainted products, and we'll get into how you can do that. But don't think that this is a distant, far-off problem. This is happening in every state in America and in every country of the world.
Yeah, definitely. And, that's one of the things that we hear a lot of people talk about, right? When they discuss the trafficking issue, they're like, well, I'm not contributing to it, right? Because they automatically think that they have to be physically buying someone. As long as they don't see that transaction, they're like, well, I'm not a part of the issue. But it's much more nuanced than, like you said, it's products, it's pornography, it's things of that nature that our society is not geared towards thinking that is part of the modern day slave trade.
It's all connected, yes. And it generates $150 billion a year in illicit profits for traffickers. It is like second only to guns and drugs for illicit global industries, and it's growing. And so there's a lot of money at stake here. And so, and that's our money. We're financing it inadvertently, of course, but we are financing it. And that's where raising awareness is so important, so that people can do something about it.
So one of the things that you touched on just a few moments ago, you were talking about the vulnerability factors that are there, some common vulnerabilities that we see. And one of the things that, is quite common, unfortunately, is the average age of a trafficking victim, like specifically here in the United States. It's quite young. Yes. Between the ages of 12 to 14. I know there's different stats out there that say it's higher, it's lower, but 12 to 14 is the generally agreed upon age range of the average age of a trafficking victim in the United States, which really, I think, shocks a lot of people when we give that statistic, because again, they have these different misconceptions about what trafficking is, right? They think it's adults, they think it's like college age women, which it is, but again, it has to do with the imagery that is out there of what trafficking looks like. So when they find out that children are targeted highly by traffickers just because there's a lot of vulnerabilities that are automatically there, right? There's a lot of things that you're going through, whether it be the hormonal changes or social changes or finding your way in the world. You have extra things that are there that are very easy to manipulate if you're an adult or if you're someone who is wise to the ways of young people. So if people go to your website, so freetheslaves.net, there's one of your pages on there that says Students Ending Slavery. So talk a little bit about that. What is that aspect? Because I think that's something that really sets you guys apart, is that you have a space that is specifically focused on young people, specifically students, which I think is something we need more of when it comes to this fight of human trafficking.
Sure. Well, I mean, the reason we did this, why we started that, was to help correct something that students are learning in school, which is that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Well, he didn't. The amendments to the Constitution in the 1800s and the Emancipation Proclamation, that outlawed slavery. It didn't really end it. And almost immediately, this form of exploitation took new forms with sharecropping and peonage and Jim Crow and other kinds of exploitation that was just as brutal and just as vicious as legal slavery had been, chattel slavery. So even though people weren't owned, as in the days of legal slavery, they were still just as exploited, and slavery has taken on new forms today. So one of our goals has been to help make sure that students get a fuller picture of the kind of the historical arc of abolition, that slavery hasn't really ended, it's taken on new forms and is spreading throughout the world today. That was one of our big goals. The other was to figure out how to connect students to the problem with ideas for what they could do. So if you go to our website, which is freetheslaves.net, and look under the Take Action vertical, you'll see Students Ending Slavery. And the idea is that you can find videos and fact sheets and quizzes and activities, timelines, frequently asked questions that students can use to write papers, can write to make presentations in class, can write to organize a campaign in their own school of awareness. We've even had students do fundraising groups, like GoFundMe things for Free the Slaves. And my idea was to provide students with the resources they would need to be able to learn and to then do something to teach their fellow classmates, or either in an after class activity, or even we've had this done in classes as well. So if you go there, all that material is just free to download and use. There are books as well that have been written by Free the Slave scholars. And so all of that material helps to connect students to this. And also there's ideas about what you can do, not just about what the problem is and where it exists and why it still exists. Although waking the world up has always been one of the pillars of Free the Slave since we founded. And so as young people are learning about the world, we feel that they need to learn this too, as opposed to find out about it down the line, because it can shape their behavior. Some people might even decide to become abolitionists, and you can now actually go to college and get a degree in human trafficking studies. So maybe some people will join directly in that way. So that's why we've done it. Also on that page, you'll see that if you wanted to take an extra step and form a chapter of Free the Slaves at your school, I think 36 colleges and 20 high schools have done that so far around the country. And then you get to use our logo. You can put it on t-shirts. We have to be a little careful about our logo and all that, just giving it away. But if you formally register a school club to help get the word spread, that actually sometimes that gives you the ability to use student facilities, to have little meetings, to have awareness sessions, and then you can sell t-shirts, use our logo, help raise funds for your organization, maybe raise some funds for Free the Slaves. So we formed this kind of, it's not a formal chapter kind of organization, but if you email us at info@freetheslaves.net, we'll send you the starter kit to get started if you wanted to do that.
That's great. That's great. I think it's so important to really get our next generation involved, like you said, with the truth about, yeah, Abraham was a part of that. He was there during that time, but he's not. Yeah, that it didn't just stop, like you said, it didn't just cease to exist from the signing of a pen. If only it had been that easy.
And there's a loophole.
Yeah.
And there's a loophole still. In the 13th Amendment, it says, slavery except as a punishment for someone convicted of a crime.
Right.
There's a loophole still. There's actually groups. There's a bill in Congress right now to get rid of that loophole.
Yeah.
Because that's what happened right after the Civil War, which was the people, enslaved people were free, but then all sorts of reasons were found to arrest them, and then they were leased out to the same farm owners, the same plantation owners where they had worked and lived in slavery and doing the same work, except now they were prisoners of the state instead of property of a slaveholder. So, and I've met people overseas who've been kept in shackles overnight. And I've talked to journalists who have seen deckhands on fishing boats off of Thailand kept in cages. And people are guarded and it's just, those, think about the images you think of modern, of old time slavery. In many places, that's still happening today around the world.
What a travesty! What a travesty. You wouldn't think that it would still be that way, with the changing of times and education and awareness. But there's, I've heard this said, wherever there's a law, there's a lawbreaker. Wherever there's going to be somebody trying to prevent a law, there's going to be someone there to break it, and that's never
true.
stopped. Yeah,
and we have found, and traffickers are adaptive and very smart, and often the same criminal gangs who traffic in drugs and other illicit products work in human trafficking as well. We've found, for example, a correlation between products, counterfeits that are made, like knockoff Nikes and Louis Vuitton bags. What factory, legitimate factories don't sew those. Who are the workers in the factories that sew those? People who are enslaved. And so, there's a certain kind of criminal opportunity here that allows people where there's a lot of money and actually very little law enforcement at the moment that's needed against the scale of the problem. So criminals will find a way.
So what's some of the things that you have seen when it comes to students getting involved? Some positive things that are happening. I know this is one of the things that when I first joined the trafficking world, I realized that there was an absence of young people. It's not like we're not out there, but it doesn't seem, it seems like in the anti-trafficking movement, there's not been a concerted or a collective effort to really focus on getting the younger generation involved. And I think that's changing. But what are some of the things that you're seeing now with young people getting involved, and how is that in your perspective? Do you see that changing the trajectory? Do you see that adding to the progression of combating human trafficking?
Yes, because one thing that also has been missing is the voice of survivors in the leadership roles of the movement. And that is changing dramatically for the past few years. And so the more that anti-trafficking organizations are able to use youth activists who are survivors, who can talk not just about their experience, because you don't want to necessarily have somebody be re-traumatized again and again and again, describing what happened to them, but actually inside leadership roles of the movement, what needs to happen? How can we communicate this effectively to people of your age group or of your demographic? Because, I'm a 64-year-old white guy. I don't necessarily know how to reach out to everybody, but youth activists can help us do that more effectively because they know the vulnerabilities. They know what it's like on the street. They know how people become estranged from their social support networks, their families, their churches, their school support networks or social clubs. And there are traffickers who are looking for this to groom people and be their boyfriends and buy them things and, oh, call me if you're having a real fight problem. And then they get them back to your car and they whisk you away. And so that happens to people who are unfortunately, in times of when families have unemployment problems or COVID related disruptions to their livelihoods or to their housing, or whether it's domestic violence, there's a lot of vulnerabilities and traffickers know to look for that. And so I think that by getting youth activists more integrated into the anti-trafficking movement, we'll be able to have a greater reach in that regards. I know there's a group called One Child out of Canada, which we do work with, that is really important in that. We're also working in other parts of the world, particularly in Africa, on this. So the hopeful signs I see, besides interdicting the traffickers and trying to break that connection where they might actually prey on someone who's vulnerable, our student groups, when students read, for example, Frederick Douglass's autobiography, which is kind of part of the core curriculum these days in many schools, because modern or historical slavery is part of the core curriculum in most school districts. And Frederick Douglass's work is amazing. You should read that book. They want to think about what can we do about it if we're in modern times, and they get blown away when they find out that some of this is still happening today. And so we, for example, we have something called the Passover Project as well, which is also under that Take Action section. And so students donate money as part of their tzedakah, their gift for their bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, to do charity as part of the receiving of gifts from the family at that point in life. We've had student groups. I know this was a Washington, D.C. area, in a wealthy area. I live near Washington, D.C. And they ran a fundraising campaign. They raised $5,000 for Free the Slaves. And that goes a long way. $5,000 overseas goes a long way to help interdict human traffickers overseas. We've had people do essay contests. There's a CNN project every year on the CNN Freedom Project that schools have participated in to mobilize around what they're doing and how they're educating and waking up not just their fellow classmates, but their parents. So here's a story. There's a billionaire in Australia who became aware of this problem because his daughter was learning about it at school. And he ended up founding one of the biggest anti-trafficking organizations in the world, Walk Free, because his daughter told him about it and he was blown away. So don't just educate each other, like work up. And there are things you can do too, like it isn't just about also interdicting that connection between a trafficker and a vulnerable person. It's also thinking about, does your school or have a program that monitors whether there's any forced labor in the contractors that work for your school? Does your school district have outsourced janitorial services or construction crews or food service crews? And in the contracts that are written, are there any clauses that are in there that says you shall not have people in forced labor in school facilities or in school contracts, and write that into the contract? There's a place for student activism. Also, say if you're at a private school, a lot of those schools have endowments, either say as a private institution or maybe through a religious organization they belong to. Where's that money invested? Is it invested in slavery-free companies? Well, find out. There's this area for student activism. Ask whether the school's endowment, I know a lot of college students have been doing this, but this is something high school students can do as well. And ask through student council and through relations with the school board and the school management, are we working through socially responsible investment funds with our endowment money? So there's things that students can and have done because they become aware of the problem and want to do what they can.
Asha, do you want to?
Yeah, those are some great ideas. You know, I mean, it kind of goes back to, well, I'm not part of this problem because I'm not actively trafficking someone, but it's, again, it goes back to the deeper level of things of activism, and then where we're spending our money, who we're giving to, who we're supporting, and how those funds are being used. So you bring up a great point there of other areas to consider. You know, rather than just making a poster or, you know, doing other things, of really getting into the nitty gritty of where follow the money, you know, they say follow the money.
Yeah, but it starts with a poster. Don't think that that's not doing
Oh,
much. So start there and
Yep.
get all rowdy about this and keep going.
Yep, for sure. And the kids love to do that. We always, you know, tell them, like, start making posters in your hallway. It's as simple as starting that way of just bringing the awareness, you know.
There's a hashtag, who made my clothes?
Oh, great. I was just going to ask you if you listed on your website, you know, other links or areas to go to know who made my clothes, or where is my endowment money going, or if you have those resources available on your website.
They are, a lot of those are in the frequently asked questions and the downloadable documents. So you go there and you click that and you get a downloadable document with lots of links and resources.
Okay, awesome. We'll add that to this interview for our readers to be able to access as well, because I know they'll want to know that for sure. So what are some other ways other than the website that people can get a hold of you or follow you or contact you?
Well, sure. You can always follow us on Facebook and Instagram, which is just freetheslaves.net, or Instagram/freetheslaves, Facebook/freetheslaves. So that's always an easy way to follow us. If you're interested in, when you go to our website, beyond the Students Ending Slavery page, if you look under the Take Action and Advocacy sections, you'll see there's lots of videos, and you can share those on your own, because they're all shareable through YouTube or through Vimeo for social media to help spread the word that way. The most important thing is contributions. So if you're able to contribute, to just go to freetheslaves.net/donate, and that helps us do the work, because awareness without action doesn't accomplish much. And so once you become aware, try to figure out how you can take the next step, whatever that step is, whether it's financial or whether it's spreading the word, or whether it's doing some advocacy kind of work within your school or your city. Take whatever step you can. Don't just brush this off as one of the other problems of the world, because we are connected to it. And on those connections, you'll see ideas of how you can do a bit of research to see whether there's a website called donegood.co, which is a website that vets all their fashion and clothing products for whether they're ethically manufactured and environmentally sustainable. There's a lot of ideas that environmental protection and human rights are actually interconnected, because a lot of the people who abuse humans don't really care much about the environment either, and the things they do are really environmentally unsustainable. So anyway, donegood.co we've worked with them before, is a place where you can actually do shopping for ethical products. The same thing is true about fair trade, thinking about what's called Fair Trade USA, which vets the products for whether the farmer and whether there's any gets a fair share of the price, whether it's environmentally sustainable, and whether there's any forced labor in the product. So there's a variety of ways, and you can see all of these on our website to help you become a conscientious consumer, so that we can not inadvertently, bankroll this problem.
Yeah, exactly. Great. Those are some great resources. I know Ashley and I both go down rabbit holes like that quite often. It's easy to do on the internet, click, 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 but you gain so much information and really realize how connected we are in just everyday purchases to this issue. So
yeah, and eventually you won't have to do that. You won't have to be like scanning barcodes to see
right.
whether this is a good product or not. That's like trying to kick down 40 million doors, right? It's like 100,000 items in a Target store, like which is good or not.
Right.
You can't actually, you have to systemically clean up industry sector by sector. And we're working not just to get stronger laws, but to get corporate responsibility through federal legislation, so that companies have a responsibility to look into their supply chains all the way down to the raw products. We would call this from shirt to dirt, from your finished shirt down to the cotton where it came from. And if they find that there's any kind of human trafficking in their product supply chain, to do something about it, not just disclose it, but actually fix it. And so that's actually happened during the Obama administration. There was an executive order that was passed that US tax dollars cannot be used for any federal contract, military or civilian, that for products or services that might be tainted by forced labor. And the US government's the largest purchaser of stuff in the world. So we're starting to work on that, consumer side of things, as well as the vulnerable victim side of things, and then the law enforcement side of things, and kind of squeeze slavery from three directions at the same time.
And I do love that you guys you're very pointed on that personal responsibility, part of it, right? Because again, looking at this problem, like you said, the 40,000 doors, right? It just seems like it's so big, but I like how you guys have broken it down into sections of like, this is what you can do today, and this is what you can expand from where you're centered at, practical things that you can do that are going to make a difference as they continue to be, to be
right.
doubled.
And it's 40 million, not 40,000. You misspoke there.
40
no
million,
problem.
yeah.
It's a big problem. And let me just say this as we kind of get towards the end here, is, it must have seemed impossible to Douglas and to Wilberforce and Clarkson in the UK and Tubman in the US that they could actually get slavery abolished 150 years ago. I mean, think of that challenge. It was considered morally acceptable, and it was considered economically necessary, baked into the economy of the world. But they succeeded, and they got it outlawed. And now it might seem equally impossible that we have 40 million doors, so to speak, or 40 million people who are trapped in this situation. That how could we possibly solve that? But we will. It's not an impossible task. They succeeded 150 years ago. Our generation, the young generation, my generation's a little older, the younger generation will succeed. We think this can be done in a generation. And if people just pull together, there's a role for everyone in this movement. And so we like to think of ourselves as following in the footsteps of the early abolitionists and just finishing the work, getting the job done that they started 150 years ago. And so, you know, we can make history. Where will we be in the history books 150 years from now? Will we be the generation that finally finished this? And so there's a place in history for us. There's a big opportunity for this. And so take the challenge.
That is a perfect note. That's a perfect note to end it on, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Terry. We really enjoyed this this interview. I know our audience will as well. So you guys go and check out freetheslaves.net. Specifically, if you're in academia, if you're a teacher, a student, a parent, definitely go and check out the resources that they have for young people to get involved and consider supporting their work and looking at starting a chapter and doing things of that nature. Because again, this is something that you can do right now in your space that's going to make a difference. And it's definitely worth it for sure. So Terry, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to talk with us.
Been a pleasure.
A lot of great information, and we really have enjoyed it.
Yes,
Thanks.
thank you, Terry. Thank you for your time, and stay strong out there in DC and keep doing what you guys are doing, and we appreciate you. And let us know if there's anything the Red Cord can ever do to help you guys.
Okay, I will. We'll stay in touch.
Great, thank you.